I trembled with rage watching my wife's brothers rearrange my room, wearing my clothes. "We're staying indefinitely," he announced with a smirk. My wife betrayed me with silence. 5 days of torture later, I disappeared without a word. Nobody expected what arrived at the doorstep next. The neighbors still talk about it. Revenge delivered, life reclaimed. You know that moment when you realize your entire life just got hijacked? Yeah, well, welcome to my personal hell. There I was, standing in the doorway of what used to be my bedroom, watching two grown-ass men rifle through my dresser like they were shopping at some twisted thrift store. And not just any two men, my wife's brothers, the dynamic duo of dysfunction I'd been dreading would show up at our door ever since Clara mentioned they were between places again. Darren, the older one with the perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and an attitude problem that could power a small city, was currently buttoning up my favorite Oxford shirt. The blue one I'd saved up 3 paychecks to buy from Brooks Brothers. He caught my eye in the mirror and had the audacity to give me this little smirk, like he was doing me a favor by stretching out the collar. "Fits pretty good," he said, adjusting the cuffs like he was born to wear designer threads instead of the usual gas station uniform he'd been sporting for the last decade. Meanwhile, Victor, the younger, somehow even lazier version of his brother, had made himself comfortable on my side of the bed. Not just sitting on it, mind you. This guy had his muddy work boots propped up on my Egyptian cotton sheets, the ones Clara and I had splurged on for our anniversary. He was scrolling through his phone, probably updating his Facebook status to "living the high life at my brother-in-law's expense," or some equally charming sentiment. The whole scene was so surreal I had to resist the urge to pinch myself. Maybe this was just some nightmare brought on by too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But no, the stench of Victor's cigarettes mixing with the cologne he'd apparently helped himself to from my bathroom cabinet was way too real. That was my Armani cologne, by the way. The stuff I only wore on special occasions because a tiny bottle cost more than most people's grocery budget. "So here's the deal," Darren announced, like he was some kind of landlord instead of a guy who'd been crashing on couches for the better part of 2 years. "We're staying indefinitely." He said that last word like it was supposed to be some kind of gift, drawing it out all slow and dramatic. Indefinite ly, like he was savoring the taste of my impending misery. I felt my hands ball up into fists before I even realized what was happening. The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through law school and landed me a decent job at the firm, was screaming at me to stay calm. Think this through. Use words, not violence. But there was this other part, this primal part that wanted nothing more than to grab both these jackasses by their greasy hair and toss them out the front door like yesterday's garbage. Instead, I turned to Clara, my wife, my partner in this thing called marriage, the woman who was supposed to have my back when her train wreck of a family came calling. She was standing right there in our bedroom doorway, close enough to see the whole pathetic display, close enough to put an end to this insanity with just a few words. "Clara," I said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into my voice despite my best efforts to sound reasonable. "You want to tell your brothers about our guest room policy? You know, the one where guests actually ask permission before moving in permanently." She looked up from her phone, because of course she was on her phone during what was arguably the most important moment of our relationship. And for just a split second, I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, maybe? Embarrassment? But then it was gone, replaced by that blank expression she got whenever she didn't want to deal with uncomfortable situations. "They're family," she said finally, like that explained everything. Like those two magic words were supposed to make me feel better about watching my home get invaded by a couple of freeloading losers who couldn't hold down jobs or apartments or apparently basic human decency. "Family," I repeated, tasting the word like it was spoiled milk. "Right. And what am I exactly? The friendly neighborhood ATM." Victor looked up from his phone long enough to snort out a laugh. "Dude, chill out. We're not asking for much. Just a place to crash until we get back on our feet." Get back on their feet. That was rich. These two had been getting back on their feet for longer than some people stayed married. Darren had bounced from job to job like a pinball, never lasting more than a few months anywhere before finding some excuse to quit or get fired. And Victor? Victor treated employment like it was an optional hobby, something to dabble in when he got really, really bored. "How long is until you get back on your feet?" I asked, even though I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. Darren shrugged, still admiring himself in my shirt. Could be a few weeks, could be a few months. Hard to say, you know? Economy's tough out there. The economy. Right. Because the economy was specifically targeting the Hayes brothers, while somehow managing to spare the rest of us responsible adults who showed up to work on time and didn't treat every employer like they were doing them a personal favor. I looked at Clara again, willing her to say something, anything, that would indicate she understood how completely insane this situation was. But she'd gone back to her phone. Scrolling through whatever mindless social media drama was apparently more important than the fact that her husband was currently being evicted from his own bedroom. That's when it hit me. The silence. It wasn't just Clara being passive or avoiding confrontation. This was active betrayal, wrapped up in the neat little package of willful ignorance. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew her brothers were going to steamroll right over me, and she was going to let them do it because it was easier than standing up to them. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, broken only by the sound of Victor's phone buzzing with notifications and Darren humming some off-key tune while he rummaged through my closet for his next fashion victim. They were settling in like they owned the place, and Clara was going to let them. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching my carefully constructed life get dismantled by two guys who thought responsibility was a dirty word. My house, my sanctuary, my reward for years of grinding through 60-hour work weeks and eating ramen noodles so I could save up for something better. All of it was being handed over to a couple of middle-aged children who'd never met a consequence they couldn't blame on someone else. And my wife, the person who was supposed to be my partner in all this, was too busy checking Instagram to notice that our marriage was circling the drain faster than water in a broken sink. That silence was worse than anything they could have said to me. Worse than Darren's smirk or Victor's casual disrespect, or even the sight of my favorite shirt getting stretched beyond recognition. That silence was the sound of my wife choosing her family over our family, choosing their comfort over my dignity, choosing the path of least resistance over what was right. That silence was betrayal in its purest form. Let me paint you a picture of what that bedroom meant to me before the Hayes brothers turned it into their personal crash pad. This wasn't just some random room with four walls and a ceiling. This was my goddamn sanctuary, the physical manifestation of every sacrifice I'd made to crawl out of the hole I was born into and become somebody who mattered. You want to know what rock bottom looks like? Try sharing a studio apartment with 3 other guys in their 20s, all of us too broke to afford privacy and too proud to move back in with our parents. Picture sleeping on a futon that had seen more bodily fluids than a hospital mattress, listening to your roommate's girlfriend fake her way through another disappointing sexual encounter while you tried to study for the bar exam with a flashlight because Steve couldn't be bothered to pay his share of the electric bill. That was my life for 3 years. 3 whole years. While other people my age were living it up in their parents' basements or getting bankrolled through college by trust funds they didn't even know they had, I was working double shifts at a law firm as a glorified coffee boy during the day and slinging drinks at TGI Fridays until 2 in the morning just to keep a roof over my head and ramen noodles in my stomach. But I had a plan. I always had a plan. Every dollar I earned went into one of 3 categories: rent, food, or my get the hell out of this nightmare fund. No movies, no dates, no spontaneous purchases of anything that wasn't absolutely essential for survival. I wore the same 3 button-down shirts on rotation until the collars started fraying, and I learned to fix everything from leaky faucets to broken microwaves because hiring a repair guy was a luxury I couldn't afford. The day I finally saved enough for a down payment on this house was better than graduation, better than passing the bar, better than getting my first real job at Henderson & Associates. I remember walking through the empty rooms for the first time as the actual owner, not just some broke-ass wannabe looking at places way outside his price range. The realtor handed me those keys, and I swear to God, I almost cried right there in the foyer. That bedroom, my bedroom, was going to be my reward for all those years of living like a monk. I spent weeks researching every single purchase, reading reviews and comparison shopping like my life depended on finding the perfect balance between quality and affordability. The king-size bed with the memory foam mattress that actually supported my back instead of trying to permanently disfigure my spine. The Egyptian cotton sheets that felt like sleeping on clouds after years of scratchy hand-me-downs. The blackout curtains that finally gave me the luxury of sleeping past sunrise without some jackass neighbor's dog barking me awake. And don't even get me started on my leather chair. That beautiful, buttery soft piece of furniture that I'd saved up for over 8 months to buy. It wasn't just a chair, it was my throne, my thinking spot, my reward for surviving another day in the corporate jungle. I'd sit there after work with a glass of decent scotch, finally able to afford the good stuff instead of whatever rotgut was on sale at the liquor store, and just breathe. Just exist in a space that was completely, totally, 100% mine. My bookshelves were another story entirely. Organized by subject, then by author within each category, every spine perfectly aligned like soldiers in formation. Law books, classic literature, biographies of people who'd actually accomplished something with their lives instead of just talking about it. Each book was a carefully considered purchase, not just random impulse buys or airport paperbacks. These were investments in my education, my growth, my transformation from the nobody I used to be into the somebody I was becoming. The closet was its own masterpiece. Suits arranged by color and season, each one representing another step up the ladder of respectability. I'd started with one decent suit from Men's Warehouse, navy blue, nothing fancy, but it fit properly and didn't look like it came from a garage sale. Then, as my salary increased and my position at the firm became more secure, I'd add another one. Charcoal gray, pinstripe, a few dress shirts that actually fit my shoulders instead of hanging on me like a scarecrow's costume. Every tie in that closet told a story. The red one I wore to my first court appearance. The conservative blue one that sealed the deal on the Morrison account. The subtle pattern that Clara said brought out my eyes, back when she still noticed things like that about me. Each piece was earned, not given. Each item represented hours of overtime, skipped lunches, and saying no to every fun thing my friends invited me to do. This house wasn't just where I lived. It was proof that I'd made it. Proof that the kid who used to eat generic cereal for dinner because it was cheaper than actual food had grown up to become someone who owned property, someone who had equity and assets and a credit score that didn't make loan officers laugh out loud. But now I was watching Darren treat my custom-organized closet like his personal shopping mall, pulling out jackets and holding them up to his body like he was getting ready for prom. The same guy who thought Payless was high-end footwear was manhandling Italian leather shoes that cost more than his monthly unemployment check. Victor had claimed my reading chair like he was some kind of literary scholar instead of a guy whose idea of intellectual stimulation was arguing with strangers on Facebook about conspiracy theories. He was eating Cheetos, actual orange-dusted Cheetos, while lounging on leather that I'd spent 2 hours every Sunday conditioning and protecting from exactly this kind of abuse. My bathroom had become their personal grooming station. My electric razor, the one I'd researched for months before buying, was sitting on the counter with someone else's whiskers still stuck in the blades. My cologne, my aftershave, my fancy shampoo that actually cleaned your hair instead of just making it smell like artificial fruit. All of it was being treated like complimentary hotel amenities. They were using my Egyptian cotton towels to dry off their unwashed bodies after showers that probably used up a month's worth of my water heater's energy. The same towels I'd hand-wash for the first 6 months I owned them because I was terrified the washing machine would somehow damage the fibers. Clara kept saying it was just family, like that phrase was some kind of magic spell that made theft and trespassing socially acceptable. But here's the thing about family. Real family respects what you've worked for. Real family doesn't treat your home like their personal charity case. Real family asks before they take, and they damn sure don't move in permanently without so much as a conversation about boundaries or expectations or basic human decency. What Clara's brothers were doing wasn't family behavior. It was trespassing with a blood relation excuse attached to it. It was turning my sanctuary into their personal welfare state, complete with free room, board, and access to everything I'd busted my ass to earn. And the worst part? They acted like they were doing me a favor by being there, like their presence was some kind of gift I should be grateful for instead of the violation it actually was. 5 days, 120 hours, 7,200 minutes of pure, concentrated hell disguised as family bonding time. If someone had told me that 5 days could feel longer than the entire 3 years I spent clawing my way through law school, while working 2 jobs, I would have laughed in their face. But here I was, living proof that time really is relative. And when your relatives are parasitic losers who treat your home like their personal all-inclusive resort, those minutes crawl by like they're moving through molasses. Day 1 started with what I can only describe as an assault on my eardrums. Darren had apparently decided that 7 a.m. was the perfect time to blast his music, and I use the term music very loosely here, because what came thundering out of my expensive Bose speakers sounded more like someone had put a garbage disposal in a blender and hit the liquefy setting. Some kind of death metal nonsense with lyrics that seemed to consist entirely of screaming about how society had wronged him and how the world owed him something. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a guy who'd never held down a steady job for more than 6 months, blasting songs about being oppressed by the system while literally living rent-free in someone else's house. But pointing out irony to the Hayes brothers was like trying to explain quantum physics to a goldfish. Technically possible, but ultimately a waste of everyone's time. I stumbled downstairs in my pajamas, hoping maybe I could have a rational conversation about volume levels and common courtesy. You know, basic human decency stuff that most people learn sometime around kindergarten. Instead, I found Darren sprawled across my leather couch, the one I'd saved up 8 months to buy, with his dirty work boots propped up on my coffee table, drinking what appeared to be the last of my good coffee. "Morning, sunshine," he said with that same smirk that was quickly becoming my least favorite facial expression in the history of human communication. "Hope you don't mind, but I helped myself to breakfast. This coffee's pretty decent for the cheap stuff." Cheap stuff. That was a $40 a pound single-origin Ethiopian blend that I ordered online because the local grocery store's idea of premium coffee came in a can with a cartoon sailor on it. But sure, Darren, tell me more about my cheap coffee while you're sitting on furniture that cost more than your last 3 paychecks combined. "Could you maybe turn the music down a little?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level and reasonable. "It's pretty early, and the neighbors." "What neighbors?" Victor called from the kitchen, apparently having helped himself to whatever he could find in my refrigerator. "This place is practically in the middle of nowhere. Who's gonna complain? Who's gonna complain? How about the guy who actually pays the mortgage and has to live with these people for the foreseeable future? How about the guy who's trying to maintain some semblance of a professional reputation in a community where word travels faster than a celebrity divorce rumor?" But instead of saying any of that, I just nodded and retreated upstairs, because apparently I'd become the kind of spineless pushover who gets walked all over by unemployed freeloaders in his own house. The music didn't get turned down. If anything, it seemed to get louder, like my polite request had been interpreted as a challenge to their masculinity. Day 2 brought the discovery that Victor had helped himself to my car keys. Not asked to borrow the car, mind you. Just took the keys off my kitchen counter like he was entitled to use my Honda Civic as his personal taxi service. I found this out when I went to leave for work and found my driveway empty except for oil stains and the lingering smell of whatever cheap cigarettes he'd been smoking with the windows rolled up. He rolled back into the driveway at 11:30 that night, 3 sheets to the wind, and apparently under the impression that my car had unlimited gas mileage, because the tank was sitting on empty despite being full when he'd taken it. When I asked where he'd been, he mumbled something about job interviews and stumbled inside, leaving my car door hanging open and my keys on the ground next to a pile of cigarette butts. Job interviews. At 11:30 at night. On a Tuesday. Sure, Victor, that sounds totally legitimate and not at all like you spent the day driving around town looking for the cheapest beer and the loosest women you could find. Day 3 was when I discovered that my kitchen had become their personal restaurant, with me apparently cast in the role of unpaid chef and dishwasher. I came home from a 12-hour day at the firm to find them both sitting at my dining room table, looking at me expectantly like I was late for my shift at the short-order cook. "Hey, man, what's for dinner?" Darren asked, like this was a completely normal question to pose to someone who'd just walked through his own front door after working his ass off all day. "We're starving over here." "We're starving." 2 grown men in their 30s, both perfectly capable of operating basic kitchen appliances, were starving because apparently the concept of cooking for themselves was as foreign to them as basic personal hygiene. So I cooked. Like an idiot, I actually went into my kitchen and made dinner for 3 people, because the alternative was listening to them whine about being hungry while they sat in my living room, contributing absolutely nothing to the household except dirty dishes and bad attitudes. I made spaghetti and meatballs. Nothing fancy, just something quick and filling that wouldn't require a lot of expensive ingredients or complicated preparation. I even made extra, thinking maybe I could have leftovers for lunch the next day and save myself a few bucks. Big mistake. Huge mistake. Because apparently my cooking was fair game for commentary and criticism from two guys whose culinary expertise peaked at heating up frozen burritos in the microwave. "This sauce is pretty bland," Victor announced between mouthfuls, like he was some kind of food critic instead of a guy who considered ketchup a vegetable. "You got any hot sauce or something to give it some flavor?" Darren nodded in agreement, already reaching for the Parmesan cheese that I'd splurged on because I actually gave a damn about eating something that didn't taste like cardboard. "Yeah, and the meatballs are kind of dry. You might want to work on your technique." "Work on my technique." Right. I should definitely take cooking advice from two guys who thought Hamburger Helper was haute cuisine and considered it a successful meal if they managed to heat it all the way through without burning down the kitchen. But the absolute worst part, the thing that made my blood pressure spike into the danger zone, was Clara's response when I tried to talk to her about the situation. I waited until we were alone in our bedroom. Well, technically still our bedroom, since Victor hadn't moved his stuff in there yet, and tried to explain how completely insane this whole situation was. "They're treating me like hired help in my own house," I said, trying to keep my voice down so the brothers wouldn't hear. "I'm working all day, coming home and cooking dinner, cleaning up after them, and they're acting like I owe them something." Clara didn't even look up from her phone. "You're overreacting," she said, like those two words were supposed to solve everything. Like my completely reasonable frustration with being turned into an unpaid servant was somehow my fault for having unrealistic expectations. Overreacting. That word hit me like a slap in the face, because it wasn't just dismissive, it was gaslighting. It was Clara telling me that my perception of reality was somehow flawed, that my anger at being disrespected in my own home was an inappropriate emotional response. By day 5, I wasn't sleeping. Not really. I'd lie there in bed, listening to them laugh and carry on downstairs like they didn't have a care in the world, while rage burned in my chest like acid reflux that wouldn't go away. They'd stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning, drinking my beer and watching my TV and acting like they owned the place. And Clara? Clara had checked out completely. She'd given up even pretending to care about my feelings or my comfort. Every conversation ended with her telling me I was overreacting, or that it was just temporary, or that they were family and I needed to be more understanding. But understanding has its limits, and I'd reached mine. 5 days of being a stranger in my own home was 4 days too many. You know what they say about the best laid plans of mice and men? Well, sometimes the best plan is no plan at all. Sometimes the smartest move is the one nobody sees coming, including yourself. That's exactly what happened on the morning of day 6, when I woke up and realized that I was done. Not frustrated, not angry, not even particularly upset anymore. Just done. Like a switch had flipped in my brain overnight, turning off every last bit of tolerance I had left for this three-ring circus that used to be my life. I didn't have some grand epiphany or dramatic moment of clarity. There was no inspirational music playing in the background, no montage of memories flashing before my eyes. It was actually pretty anticlimactic, if you want the truth. I just opened my eyes at 5:30 in the morning, listened to Victor snoring on my couch downstairs. Apparently he'd passed out there again after another night of treating my living room like his personal frat house, and thought, nope, not today, not anymore. The beautiful thing about hitting rock bottom is that it gives you perfect clarity about what really matters. And what mattered to me in that moment wasn't salvaging my marriage or maintaining family harmony or keeping up appearances for the neighbors. What mattered was getting my life back, even if it meant blowing up everything else in the process. I slipped out of bed like some kind of ninja, moving carefully so I wouldn't wake Clara. Not because I was trying to be considerate, that ship had sailed about 4 days ago, but because the last thing I needed was her trying to talk me out of what I was about to do. She'd want to have a conversation, to work things out, to find some compromise that would somehow magically make everyone happy. But I was way past the point where talking could fix anything. You want to know the difference between a strategic retreat and just giving up? Planning. Even though I hadn't consciously decided to leave until that morning, Some part of my brain had apparently been preparing for this moment all week. I knew exactly what I needed to take and what I could leave behind. Essentials only. Clothes for a few days, my laptop, important documents, and enough cash to keep me afloat until I figured out my next move. I grabbed one small duffel bag from the closet, the same one I'd used for weekend trips back when Clara and I actually did things together, and started packing. 3 changes of clothes, my good shoes, toiletries, phone charger, and the folder containing all my important papers. Birth certificate, passport, social security card, insurance documents, and most importantly, the deed to the house. Amazing how much of your entire life can fit into a bag that's smaller than what most people take on vacation. The whole process took maybe 20 minutes, and I moved through it with the kind of calm efficiency that surprised even me. No second guessing, no emotional breakdown, no dramatic internal monologue about the symbolism of packing up my life. Just pure, practical action focused on getting the hell out of Dodge before anyone else woke up. The hardest part was walking past my bookshelves without taking anything. Those books represented years of careful collecting, each one chosen for a specific reason and acquired at the perfect moment when I could afford it without breaking my budget. But books are heavy, and weight was the enemy of stealth. Besides, leaving them behind was actually part of the plan, even if I hadn't fully realized it yet. They were proof that this was my house, my sanctuary, my carefully constructed life that was being violated by people who had no appreciation for what any of it meant. I crept downstairs like I was infiltrating enemy territory, which wasn't really that far from the truth when you think about it. Victor was sprawled across my leather couch in yesterday's clothes, snoring loud enough to wake the dead, and apparently having used my throw pillows as tissue boxes based on the state they were in. There were empty beer bottles on my coffee table, my beer bottles, naturally, and what looked like the remains of a pizza that had definitely not been ordered with my permission. Darren's shoes were kicked off by the front door, along with a trail of clothes leading toward the guest bathroom that suggested he'd gotten undressed on his way to take a shower. Using my towels, my soap, my hot water, all without contributing so much as a thank you or $1 toward the utility bills that were still coming in my name only. The kitchen was a disaster zone that would have made a FEMA inspector weep. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, food containers left open on the counter, and what appeared to be the remnants of some kind of cooking experiment gone wrong splattered across my stove. These weren't just messy house guests. These were full-grown adults who had apparently never learned the basic life skill of cleaning up after themselves. But here's the thing that really got to me. None of it made me angry anymore. Standing there in my destroyed kitchen, looking at the evidence of 5 days' worth of complete disrespect, I felt nothing. No rage, no frustration, no desire to wake them up and demand they explain themselves. Just a cold, calculating calm that probably should have scared me, but actually felt pretty damn liberating. I left through the back door, the same way I used to sneak out as a teenager when I didn't want to deal with my parents' questions about where I was going and when I'd be back. Except this time, I wasn't planning on coming back. At least not until I'd figured out how to reclaim my house and my life from the people who'd stolen both. My car was still parked where Victor had left it the night before, thankfully with enough gas to get me where I needed to go. I threw my bag in the back seat and sat there for a minute, looking at the house that had been my pride and joy just a week ago. It looked the same from the outside. Same well-maintained lawn, same fresh paint, same neighborhood that had made me feel like I'd finally made it in the world. But I knew what was happening inside, and that knowledge changed everything. No dramatic goodbye. No note explaining where I was going or when I might be back. No final confrontation or ultimatum or attempt to make them understand what they'd done wrong. Just silence. Pure, deliberate, strategic silence that would speak louder than any argument I could have made. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, not bothering to look back. Let them wake up to an empty house and wonder where the hell their meal ticket had gone. Let Clara try to explain to her brothers why the guy who'd been funding their extended vacation had suddenly vanished without a trace. Let them all sit around trying to figure out what they'd done wrong, when the answer was literally everything. For the first time in 6 days, I was the one calling the shots. And that felt pretty damn good. You ever notice how the best sleep you get is when you're somewhere you're not supposed to be? I'm talking about that deep, dreamless sleep that only comes when you've completely removed yourself from every source of stress in your life. even if it means crashing on someone else's couch like a college kid who flunked out but hasn't told his parents yet. That's exactly the kind of sleep I got my first night at Mark's place. And let me tell you, it was better than any five-star hotel I'd ever stayed in. Mark Sullivan had been my study partner back in law school, one of those naturally brilliant guys who made everything look effortless while the rest of us were pulling all-nighters and surviving on coffee and Adderall. He'd landed a sweet gig at a corporate firm right out of school, the kind of place where they gave you a signing bonus bigger than most people's annual salary and expected you to bill enough hours to justify it. But Mark was smart about money, smarter than me, apparently, since he'd managed to buy not just one property but two, including this little one-bedroom apartment across town that he kept as a rental investment. When I showed up at his door at 6 in the morning looking like a refugee from my own life, Mark took one look at my face and didn't ask any questions. That's the mark of a true friend, knowing when someone needs help and not making them jump through hoops to get it. He just grabbed his coffee, tossed me a spare key, and said, "Third floor, apartment 3B. Tenant moved out last week, so it's all yours until I find someone new." No interrogation about what had happened. No lecture about working things out with my wife. No unsolicited advice about family dynamics or marriage counseling. Just a solution to my immediate problem and the understanding that I'd explain everything when I was ready. That kind of no-questions-asked friendship is rarer than an honest politician, and I made a mental note to pay this favor forward somehow once I got my life sorted out. The apartment was perfect for my purposes, small, clean, and completely anonymous. Generic furniture that came with the rental, basic cable, reliable internet, and most importantly, no trace of the Hayes brothers anywhere within a 50-mile radius. I could actually hear myself think for the first time in a week, which was both a relief and a revelation. I'd forgotten what silence sounded like when it wasn't punctuated by obnoxious music or drunken laughter or the sound of people helping themselves to things that didn't belong to them. That first day, I called in sick to work, legitimately sick, as far as I was concerned, because 5 days of psychological torture had definitely taken a toll on my mental health. I spent the morning just sitting in Mark's recliner, drinking decent coffee and processing what the hell had just happened to my life. It was like emerging from a fog and suddenly being able to see clearly again, except what I could see wasn't exactly pretty. My marriage was over. Not just damaged or going through a rough patch, but completely, irreparably finished. You can't come back from the kind of betrayal Clara had shown me. The casual way she dismissed my feelings and chosen her deadbeat brothers over her own husband. Some people might call that an overreaction, but those people had probably never watched their spouse stand by while their home got turned into a homeless shelter for grown men who'd never learned how to adult properly. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. It gives you a strange kind of freedom. When you've got nothing left to lose, you can start making decisions based on what you actually want instead of what other people expect from you. And what I wanted was revenge. Not the hot, emotional kind that makes you do stupid things you regret later, but cold, calculated, strategic revenge that would leave lasting scars. That's when I started planning. Real planning, not just the angry fantasies you have when someone's pissed you off. I pulled out a legal pad, old habits die hard, and started mapping out everything I knew about my situation. Assets, liabilities, legal standings, potential vulnerabilities. The house was in my name only, which Clara had always said was fine because it's all ours anyway. Funny how that casual attitude about ownership was about to bite her in the ass. The mortgage was mine, the utilities were in my name, the insurance policies listed me as the primary holder. Clara had never wanted the responsibility of paperwork, happy to let me handle all the boring adult stuff while she focused on whatever it was she did with her time these days. Apparently, that included enabling her brother's freeloading lifestyle, but that was about to become a much more expensive hobby. I called Mark that afternoon and asked if he knew any good lawyers who specialized in family law. Not because I trusted him to keep his mouth shut, although I did, but because Mark had connections everywhere, and I needed someone who could help me navigate the legal complexities of what I was about to do. "You thinking about divorce?" he asked, which was a reasonable question given the circumstances. "I'm thinking about a lot of things," I said, which was the truth. "But first, I need to understand my options when it comes to property rights and tenant law." Mark was quiet for a minute, probably putting together the pieces of what I was planning. You want someone who specializes in landlord-tenant disputes. Among other things, yeah. I know just the guy. Tommy Brennan, graduated 2 years ahead of us. He's got a practice that focuses on property law and eviction proceedings. Real bulldog when it comes to getting people out of places they don't belong. Perfect. That was exactly what I needed, a legal bulldog with experience in removing unwanted tenants. Because that's what Darren and Victor were, when you got right down to it. Tenants. Unwanted, non-paying, destructive tenants who had overstayed their welcome in someone else's property. But the real stroke of genius came from Mark's cousin Danny, who owned a moving and clean-out company. Danny specialized in what he called life transitions, helping people who were downsizing, getting divorced, or cleaning out estates after someone died. He'd seen every kind of domestic drama you could imagine, and he had a crew of guys who could move furniture with the efficiency of a NASCAR pit crew. You thinking about moving some stuff around? Mark asked when I brought up Danny's services. Something like that, I said. How quickly could they furnish an empty house? Depends on what kind of furniture you're talking about. Danny keeps a warehouse full of stuff he's picked up from estate sales and foreclosures. Nothing fancy, but functional. He could probably outfit a whole house in a few hours if you needed him to. The plan was starting to come together in my head, and it was beautiful in its simplicity. If Darren and Victor wanted to play house in my property, I was going to make sure they got the full homeowner experience. All of it. The responsibility, the bills, the consequences of their actions. Everything they'd been avoiding their entire adult lives was about to catch up with them in the most humiliating way possible. I spent that evening researching landlord-tenant law, property rights, and eviction procedures. Knowledge is power, and I was about to become the most powerful man in this particular equation. Clara and her brothers thought they'd won by forcing me out of my own house, but they had no idea what kind of storm was brewing. They wanted to treat my home like their personal welfare state? Fine. I was about to show them exactly how expensive that decision was going to be. There's something deeply satisfying about watching a perfectly executed plan unfold, especially when the people on the receiving end have absolutely no idea what's hitting them. It's like watching a master chess player set up checkmate 15 moves in advance, while their opponent is still trying to figure out which piece is the horsey. That Tuesday morning, as I sat in my rental car across the street from my own house, sipping coffee and waiting for the show to begin, I felt like Bobby Fischer about to deliver the most beautiful checkmate in the history of the game. The moving trucks arrived at exactly 8 a.m., which was perfect timing because that's when Darren and Victor were usually starting to think about maybe possibly considering. The idea of waking up. Danny's crew was efficient as hell. 3 trucks, 8 guys, and enough secondhand furniture to outfit a small apartment complex. They moved with the kind of precision you only see in professional operations, each guy knowing exactly what his job was and how to do it without wasting time or energy. The first sign that something was wrong came when Mrs. Henderson from next door peeked out her front door, probably wondering why there was suddenly a convoy of moving trucks parked on our usually quiet suburban street. Mrs. Henderson was the neighborhood watch captain, which basically meant she had appointed herself the official gossip coordinator for a 6-block radius. Nothing happened on Maple Street without Mrs. Henderson knowing about it, analyzing it, and sharing her findings with anyone who would listen. I watched her grab her phone, probably texting the neighborhood group chat that had been buzzing with speculation ever since I'd disappeared 3 days ago. The official story, according to Clara's Facebook posts, was that I was out of town on business, which was technically true if you considered plotting revenge against your wife's freeloading brothers a business venture. The real entertainment started when the brothers finally stumbled outside, looking like extras from a zombie movie who hadn't gotten the memo that filming had wrapped. Darren appeared first, wearing my favorite polo shirt and a confused expression that suggested his brain was still trying to boot up for the day. Victor emerged a few minutes later, scratching himself in places that really shouldn't be scratched in public and squinting at the trucks like they were some kind of optical illusion. What the hell is this? Darren called out to the lead mover, a stocky guy named Pete who looked like he could bench press a refrigerator without breaking a sweat. Pete consulted his clipboard with the kind of professional indifference that comes from years of dealing with confused customers. Moving and delivery service for Darren and Victor Hayes, residents of 1247 Maple Street. We've got furniture and household items to be moved in today. We didn't order any furniture, Victor protested. which was probably the first honest thing he'd said since moving into my house. Take it up with whoever placed the order, Pete shrugged. I just moved the stuff where it's supposed to go. You got a problem with the delivery, call the company. That's when things got really interesting. See, the beauty of my plan wasn't just that I was delivering furniture to my own house. It was the kind of furniture I was delivering. Danny had outdone himself in selecting the most perfectly awful collection of secondhand crap he could find. We're talking about furniture that looked like it had been rejected by a college dorm for being too ugly and uncomfortable. The moving crew started hauling in recliners that had probably seen more bodily fluids than a hospital emergency room. Fold-out couches that looked like they'd been designed by someone who had a personal vendetta against human comfort. Coffee tables that were held together with duct tape and hope. Kitchen chairs that wobbled like they were auditioning for a slapstick comedy routine. But the real masterpiece was the bunk beds. Adult-sized bunk beds that looked like they'd been salvaged from a prison that had been condemned for human rights violations. The kind of beds that made you question every life choice that had led you to sleeping on them. Pete and his crew hauled them right into what used to be my master bedroom, assembling them with the efficiency of people who had clearly done this many times before. Hey, wait a minute, Darren yelled, finally realizing that his temporary paradise was being systematically downgraded to match his actual station in life. You can't just come in here and rearrange our stuff. Your stuff? Pete asked, raising an eyebrow. According to my work order, this is all your stuff. We're just delivering it to your current residence. The neighbors were having a field day with this whole spectacle. Sandra Morrison from across the street had positioned herself on her front porch with a cup of coffee, pretending to water plants that clearly didn't need watering. Bob and Linda Chun had found urgent yard work that needed to be done in their front lawn, giving them the perfect vantage point to observe the chaos unfolding at the Hayes residence. Even old Mr. Patterson, who usually minded his own business and kept to himself, had mysteriously decided that Tuesday morning was the perfect time to wash his car in his driveway, positioning himself for optimal viewing of the furniture parade. The moving crew worked with the kind of systematic thoroughness that would have made a military logistics officer weep with pride. Out went my carefully curated furniture, loaded onto trucks with the efficiency of people who knew exactly where everything was supposed to go. In came the island of misfit furniture, each piece more gloriously awful than the last. A dining room table that looked like it had been built by someone who had only heard furniture described to them secondhand. Lamps that provided just enough light to see how depressing everything else was. A refrigerator that was older than some of the people moving it, complete with that lovely yellow tint that screams, I've been in more apartments than a pizza delivery guy. Clara showed up right in the middle of the transition, probably alerted by the neighborhood emergency alert system that Mrs. Henderson had undoubtedly activated. She pulled into the driveway just as Pete's crew was hauling out my leather sectional, the one I'd saved up for over a year to buy, and replacing it with a couch that looked like it had been upholstered with material rejected by a 1970s hotel chain. What is this? She screamed, which was really more of a rhetorical question since the answer was pretty obvious to anyone with functioning eyeballs. Ma'am, we're just following our work orders, Pete explained with the patience of someone who dealt with hysterical customers on a regular basis. Furniture delivery and setup for the current residents. Current residents? Clara's voice cracked like she was going through puberty again. This is my house. Pete consulted his clipboard again. According to our paperwork, this property is currently occupied by Darren and Victor Hayes. We're just making sure they have appropriate furnishings for their living situation. The beautiful thing about bureaucracy is that once it gets rolling, it's almost impossible to stop. Pete had official paperwork, work orders signed by someone with apparent authority, and a crew of guys who just wanted to finish the job and move on to the next one. Clara could scream and protest all she wanted, but Pete's job was to move furniture, not to arbitrate domestic disputes. The whole process took about 3 hours, during which time the entire neighborhood got a front row seat to the most entertaining reality show they'd ever seen. By the time the trucks pulled away, 12:47, Maple Street had been transformed from a middle-class suburban home into something that looked like a halfway house for people with questionable life choices. And the mailbox? That got updated too. A nice, professional-looking label that read, Hayes Residence, in bold letters. Because if Darren and Victor were going to live there indefinitely, they might as well make it official. The phone call came exactly 24 hours after the furniture brigade had finished their masterwork, which was perfect timing because it gave Clara just enough time to fully absorb the magnitude of what had happened to her little fantasy world. When my ringtone started playing, she'd always insisted on keeping her own special tone, some cheesy love song that now felt more like a funeral dirge. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Not because I was busy, but because I wanted her to sit there for those extra few seconds, wondering if I was even going to pick up. "Hello, Clara," I said, keeping my voice as neutral as a customer service representative who'd already decided you weren't getting your money back. "What is this?" she practically shrieked into the phone, and I could hear the hysteria bubbling just beneath the surface of her usually controlled exterior. "Why are there strangers moving furniture into the house?" Strangers? That was rich, coming from someone who'd invited 2 professional strangers into our home and expected me to treat them like honored guests. But I wasn't about to point out the irony just yet. That would come later, when she was really desperate. "Your brothers said they're staying indefinitely," I replied, examining my fingernails like this was the most boring conversation I'd had all week. I made it easier for them. There was a pause on the other end, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she tried to process what I'd just said. Clara had always prided herself on being the smart one in our relationship, the one who could think 3 steps ahead and manipulate situations to her advantage. But apparently, her strategic thinking skills had some serious blind spots when it came to predicting the consequences of her own actions. "You're being petty," she said finally, which was exactly the response I'd been expecting. When Clara couldn't win an argument with logic, she always resorted to personal attacks designed to make the other person feel guilty for having perfectly reasonable reactions to her unreasonable behavior. "No," I said, letting the word hang in the air for a moment like a judge delivering a verdict. "I'm being exact." Exact. That was the perfect word for what I was doing, because this wasn't about emotion or revenge or even anger anymore. This was about precision. Mathematical precision. Clara and her brothers had introduced variables into my life equation, and I was simply adjusting the other variables to balance things out. They wanted to live in my house indefinitely? Fine. I was making sure they got the full residential experience, complete with furniture that matched their actual socioeconomic status instead of mine. "This is insane," Clara continued, and I could hear her voice starting to shake. You can't do this. It's our house. Our house." Funny how it had suddenly become our house, now that there were consequences involved. For the past week, when I'd been complaining about her brothers treating the place like their personal crash pad, it had been just family, and I was overreacting. But now that the situation was affecting her comfort level, suddenly she wanted to claim joint ownership. "Actually, I can do this," I said, settling back in Mark's comfortable recliner and enjoying the sound of Clara's world imploding in real time. "It's my house, Clara. My name on the deed, my name on the mortgage, my name on all the utility bills. Your brothers are my guests, and I wanted to make sure they felt at home." The silence that followed was the kind of dead air that radio DJs have nightmares about. I could hear Clara breathing, probably trying to come up with some kind of counterargument that would magically transform her brothers from freeloading parasites into legitimate house guests who deserved to sleep on Egyptian cotton sheets and eat meals prepared by their unpaid chef. But here's the thing about reality. It doesn't care about your feelings or your convenience or your carefully constructed delusions about how the world should work. Reality is what happens when your chickens come home to roost. And Clara's chickens had just arrived in a convoy of moving trucks filled with secondhand furniture that smelled like other people's regrets. "Where are you?" she asked, and there was a new note in her voice now. Not anger or indignation, but something that sounded suspiciously like panic. "Why won't you come home and talk about this like adults?" Like adults. That was beautiful, coming from someone who'd spent the last week enabling 2 grown men who'd never met a responsibility they couldn't shirk or a free meal they couldn't mooch. But I wasn't about to get drawn into a debate about what constituted adult behavior, because I had something much better than words. I had results. In the background of our conversation, I could hear the chaos that had replaced the peaceful suburban sanctuary I'd worked so hard to create. Darren was shouting about something, probably the washing machine, which according to my sources had mysteriously stopped working around the same time the furniture delivery had been completed. Victor was demanding dinner in that whiny tone that suggested he'd never learned the difference between asking and commanding. The beautiful thing about chaos is that it has a way of revealing people's true characters. When everything is going smoothly and life is comfortable, it's easy to maintain the illusion that you're a good person who makes good choices. But when the pressure starts building and the conveniences start disappearing, that's when you find out what someone is really made of. And what Clara was apparently made of was the kind of person who would throw her husband under the bus to avoid confronting her family's dysfunction. The kind of person who would choose the path of least resistance even when that path led directly through her marriage's funeral pyre. "I can't take this anymore," she said. And now she wasn't even trying to hide the desperation in her voice. "They won't leave. Please come back. They won't leave." After spending a week telling me I was overreacting to their presence, after insisting that it was just family and I needed to be more understanding, Clara had finally discovered what I'd been trying to tell her all along. That her brothers had no intention of being temporary guests. They'd found a sucker willing to subsidize their lifestyle, and they were going to milk that situation for every penny it was worth. "Gee, that's a real problem," I said, not bothering to hide the sarcasm dripping from every word. "If only someone had warned you that inviting unemployed freeloaders to stay indefinitely might not work out exactly the way you planned." "This isn't funny," Clara snapped, but I could hear the exhaustion creeping into her voice. Running interference for two grown men who refused to take responsibility for their own lives was apparently more tiring than she'd anticipated. "You're right," I agreed. "It's not funny at all. It's exactly what you chose when you chose them over me. This is the life you picked, Clara. Enjoy every minute of it." I hung up before she could respond, because there really wasn't anything left to say. She'd made her choice, and now she was living with the consequences. The best part was that this was just the beginning. I had so many more surprises in store for the Hayes family residence, and Clara was about to discover that indefinite house guests came with indefinite complications. My phone buzzed with a text message almost immediately. "We need to talk." I deleted it without responding and turned off my phone. Talking was what got me into this mess in the first place. From now on, I was going to let my actions do all the talking for me. 2 weeks. That's how long it took for Clara's carefully constructed world of denial to completely implode, and honestly, I'm surprised it lasted that long. I'd given the whole situation maybe a week before she came crawling back, begging me to fix the mess she'd created. But Clara had always been stubborn, and apparently she was willing to endure a lot more chaos than I'd given her credit for before admitting that maybe, just maybe, her beloved brothers weren't the harmless house guests she'd pretended they were. The first crack in her facade came courtesy of Darren's shopping addiction. See, when you're living rent-free in someone else's house, eating someone else's food, and wearing someone else's clothes, it's easy to start feeling like you're entitled to someone else's credit as well. And Darren, being the entrepreneurial spirit he was, had apparently decided that my old Amazon account was community property. I found out about his little shopping spree through my credit card alert system. You know, that handy feature that sends you a text every time someone charges more than $100 to your account. My phone started buzzing like a teenager's during prom season, and at first I thought there might be some kind of system error. Surely nobody was stupid enough to rack up $1,500 worth of charges on someone else's credit card in a single afternoon. But no, there it was in beautiful black and white. A 65-inch smart TV, a PlayStation 5, some kind of high-end sound system, and enough video games to stock a GameStop. All of it ordered with next-day delivery to 1247 Maple Street, charged to the credit card that Darren had apparently memorized from all those times I'd ordered takeout during their visit. The beautiful thing about identity theft is that it's really easy to prove when the perpetrator is stupid enough to have everything delivered to the same address where he's currently squatting. I called my credit card company from Mark's apartment, explained the situation to a very understanding customer service representative, and had all the charges reversed within 20 minutes. The company also flagged my account for suspicious activity and sent new cards to my current address, effectively cutting off Darren's shopping spree before he could really get warmed up. But the real entertainment value came from watching the aftermath. See, when you order stuff for next-day delivery and then the payment gets declined, the delivery company tends to want their merchandise back. And they're not particularly gentle about the process. especially when they suspect fraud might be involved. I heard about the repo visit through Mrs. Henderson, who called me directly because she was concerned about all the unusual activity at my house. Apparently, a truck from a recovery company had shown up at 8 in the morning with some very official-looking paperwork and some very unofficial-looking guys who specialized in retrieving merchandise from people who couldn't or wouldn't pay for it. They took everything, Mrs. Henderson said, and I could hear the barely contained glee in her voice. The TV, some kind of game system, boxes and boxes of stuff. Your wife's brothers were standing on the lawn arguing with the driver, but he just kept loading everything back onto the truck. I made appropriate sympathetic noises while internally doing a victory dance. There's nothing quite like the satisfaction of watching someone get hoisted by their own petard, especially when that someone has been freeloading off your hospitality for weeks. But Darren's shopping spree was just the appetizer. The main course came courtesy of Victor's social life, which apparently involved inviting every degenerate in a 20-mile radius to come party at what he'd started calling the house. Not my house, or even my brother-in-law's house, but just the house. Like it was some kind of community center specifically designed for unemployed losers who'd never met a beer they couldn't finish or a mess they couldn't leave for someone else to clean up. The party started small, just Victor and a couple of his drinking buddies hanging out in the backyard, playing music loud enough to rattle windows 3 houses away. But like most things involving the Hayes brothers, the situation escalated quickly from annoying to completely unacceptable. By the second week, the parties had moved inside and expanded to include people who brought their own people, until my formerly peaceful suburban home had turned into some kind of halfway house for adults who'd given up on adulting. We're talking about complete strangers drinking my liquor, smoking cigarettes in my living room, and apparently using my bathroom for activities that weren't covered in any homeowner's manual. The noise complaints started rolling in around day 10. Mrs. Henderson, of course, was the first to call the police, but she was quickly joined by the Chens, the Pattersons, and pretty much everyone else within a 3-block radius who valued their sleep and their property values. The cops showed up twice in 1 week, both times finding my house packed with people who scattered like cockroaches when the lights came on. But the real breaking point came when one of Victor's party guests decided that my driveway wasn't quite roomy enough for all the cars and started parking on my neighbor's lawn. Bob Chun was not the kind of guy who appreciated strangers treating his carefully maintained landscaping like a parking lot, and he made his feelings known in the kind of colorful language that would have made a sailor blush. The confrontation escalated quickly from a property dispute to a full-blown neighborhood incident, complete with yelling, threats, and someone calling the police again. By the time the dust settled, there were tire tracks gouged into Bob's front yard, beer bottles scattered across 3 different properties, and a general consensus among the neighbors that something needed to be done about the ongoing crisis at 1247 Maple Street. That's when Clara's 2 a.m. text message arrived. "I can't take this anymore. They won't leave. Please come back." I read that message 3 times, savoring every word like a fine wine. I can't take this anymore. After weeks of telling me I was overreacting, after insisting that her brothers were just going through a rough patch and needed family support, after choosing their comfort over my sanity, Clara had finally reached the point where she couldn't take it anymore. They won't leave. The same brothers who were supposed to be staying just until they got back on their feet had apparently decided that their feet were perfectly comfortable right where they were. Thank you very much. The same brothers who Clara had insisted were just family had revealed themselves to be exactly what I'd said they were from the beginning. Parasites who would suck their host dry and then look around for their next victim. Please come back. Not, we need to talk, or let's work this out, or any of the other diplomatic phrases she'd been using during our previous conversations. Just a straight-up plea for help from someone who'd finally realized that she was in way over her head. I set the phone down without responding, because Clara needed to understand that begging wasn't going to fix this situation. She'd made her choice when she chose silence over support, when she decided that maintaining family harmony was more important than protecting her marriage. Now she was discovering what life looked like when you prioritized the wrong people, and frankly, the lesson was long overdue. The best part was knowing that this was just the beginning. I had so many more surprises in store for the Hayes residents, and Clara was about to learn that sometimes the price of bad decisions keeps going up long after you think you've paid in full. You know what's beautiful about the legal system? When it works the way it's supposed to, it's like watching a perfectly choreographed ballet performed by people in expensive suits who bill by the hour. Every movement has purpose, every document has weight, and every signature carries the force of law behind it. And when you've spent years working in that system, learning its rhythms and understanding its power, you develop a deep appreciation for how elegantly it can solve problems that seem impossible to handle any other way. Tommy Brennan's office was exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer who specialized in making people's problems disappear through the strategic application of paperwork. Clean lines, expensive furniture, and law books arranged with the kind of precision that screamed, "I know exactly which statute applies to your particular brand of stupidity." Tommy himself was one of those guys who'd figured out early in law school that looking the part was half the battle, and he'd perfected the art of projecting competent authority without seeming like a complete asshole about it. "So," Tommy said, leaning back in his leather chair after I'd explained the situation, "you want to make this as legally airtight and personally devastating as possible. I want to make sure there are consequences," I corrected, because this wasn't about being vindictive. It was about ensuring that actions had appropriate results. Clara made a choice to prioritize her brothers over her marriage. I'm just making sure she gets to live with that choice permanently. Tommy nodded like he'd heard this story 1,000 times before, which he probably had. Family law was full of people who'd made terrible decisions and then acted surprised when those decisions came back to bite them in the ass. The only difference was that most of his clients waited until after their lives had completely imploded before seeking professional help. I was being proactive. The separation papers were a work of art. Not the kind of art you'd hang in a museum, but the kind of art that serves a specific, practical purpose while still maintaining a certain aesthetic beauty. Every clause was carefully crafted to maximize legal protection while minimizing opportunities for dispute. Every paragraph was designed to close loopholes before Clara even knew they existed. The house remained under my name exclusively, which meant I retained complete control over who lived there and under what conditions. The joint bank accounts were frozen pending final settlement, which effectively cut off funding for any continued freeloading activities. The credit cards were canceled and replaced with new accounts that only I could access. In short, every financial thread that connected Clara to my resources was systematically severed with surgical precision. But the real masterpiece was the section dealing with property and personal belongings. See, when you're dealing with people who have a flexible relationship with the concept of ownership, you need to be very specific about what belongs to whom. The papers spelled out in excruciating detail exactly which items were my separate property, which items were marital assets subject to division, and which items had been purchased by me for my exclusive use. That expensive sound system Darren had been enjoying? Mine. The kitchen appliances he'd been using to prepare his gourmet ramen noodle dinners? Mine. The leather furniture Victor had been treating like his personal bed? Definitely mine. Even the towels, sheets, and basic household supplies were listed as separate property, purchased with my income for my personal use. Tommy's colleague, a process server named Janet who looked like she could arm wrestle a professional wrestler and win, was the one who got to deliver the papers. I specifically requested that the service happen at the house, during peak neighborhood activity hours, because if you're going to make a statement, you might as well make sure everyone gets to hear it. According to Janet's report, which she delivered with the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from a job well done, Clara answered the door expecting a delivery of some kind. Maybe she was hoping for more of Darren's fraudulent purchases, or perhaps she thought I'd finally come to my senses and was sending flowers as an apology. Instead, she got a legal document that spelled out exactly how much her family loyalty was going to cost her. She went completely white. Janet told me over coffee the next day. Just stood there staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Then she started reading out loud, and by the time she got to the property division section, she was practically hyperventilating. The neighbors, of course, had front row seats to the whole performance. Mrs. Henderson was conveniently checking her mailbox when Janet arrived, and somehow managed to make that simple task last for the entire duration of the document delivery. Bob Chin found urgent hedge trimming that needed to be done in his front yard, giving him perfect audio access to Clara's increasingly frantic questions about whether this was some kind of joke. But the real entertainment came when Darren emerged from the house to see what all the commotion was about. According to Janet, he took one look at the legal papers and immediately started demanding to know what was going on, as if he had some kind of legitimate stake in the proceedings. The beautiful thing about legal documents is that they don't care about your feelings or your sense of entitlement. They just lay out the facts in language that's designed to be absolutely unambiguous. The facts, in this case, were pretty simple. Clara was being served with separation papers that would effectively end her access to everything she'd taken for granted during our marriage. The house, the money, the credit cards, even the basic utilities were all tied to my name and my income, which meant that her brother's rent-free vacation was about to come to a very expensive end. Within a month, everything had changed. The locks were changed by a professional locksmith who specialized in high-security installations, because if you're going to keep people out, you might as well make sure they stay out. The utility accounts were updated to reflect the new security protocols, with passwords and verification procedures that would have impressed a bank security officer. But the most satisfying part was watching the brothers' belongings. Those stolen shirts, those muddy shoes, that general air of entitlement they'd been wearing like a uniform, get unceremoniously dumped on the curb like the trash they'd always been. I hired the same moving company that had delivered their new furniture to reverse the process, removing every trace of their presence from my property and depositing it in a neat pile on the sidewalk. The neighborhood turned out for that show like it was a free outdoor concert. Mrs. Henderson brought lawn chairs. The Chins set up what looked suspiciously like a tailgate party. Even old Mr. Patterson emerged from his usual hermit routine to witness the spectacle of two grown men sorting through their possessions while wearing the kind of shocked expressions usually reserved for natural disaster victims. Clara tried calling, of course, multiple times, but I'd learned my lesson about engaging with people who'd already shown me exactly who they were and what they valued. The papers spoke for themselves, and they said everything that needed to be said about the future of our relationship. The beautiful thing about legal consequences is that they don't require ongoing emotional investment from the person who sets them in motion. Once the paperwork is filed and the process is started, the system takes over and handles all the messy details. I didn't have to argue or negotiate or listen to excuses. I just had to let the law do what it was designed to do. And what it was designed to do, in this case, was make sure that people who made bad choices got to live with those choices permanently, completely, and very publicly. There's something deeply poetic about not going back to the scene of the crime, even when the crime was committed against you and you technically won. That house on Maple Street, my house, legally and morally, had served its purpose as the battlefield where I'd fought and won the war for my dignity. But winning a war doesn't mean you want to live in the ruins afterward, surrounded by the ghosts of everything that went wrong and the constant reminders of how close you came to losing yourself completely. The loft I found was everything that house had never been, honest. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't, didn't promise suburban dreams or family harmony or any of the other fairy tales that people tell themselves when they're trying to convince themselves that compromise is the same thing as happiness. It was just space, clean, efficient, unapologetically masculine space that belonged to me and only me. The building itself was one of those converted warehouses that developers love to market to young professionals who want to feel edgy and urban without actually having to deal with the inconveniences of genuine city living. Exposed brick walls, hardwood floors that had actually been walked on by people who worked for a living, and windows big enough to let in natural light, instead of the carefully filtered artificial illumination that suburban homes specialized in. But the best part was the silence. Not the oppressive silence of people who were angry with each other and couldn't figure out how to communicate, but the peaceful silence of someone who'd finally stopped trying to make other people happy at his own expense. I could actually hear myself think for the first time in years, and what I heard was pretty damn encouraging. My bookshelves looked better in the loft than they ever had in the suburban house. Maybe it was the exposed brick backdrop, or maybe it was just the knowledge that every book on those shelves was there because I'd chosen it, not because it looked good or impressed visitors or fit some kind of domestic aesthetic that wasn't really mine. These were my books, arranged according to my system, in my space, for my enjoyment. The suits hung in the closet like old friends waiting for their next adventure. No more worrying about whether Darren had stretched out the shoulders or whether Victor had helped himself to my ties for some job interview that would never materialize. Every piece of clothing in that closet was mine, had always been mine, and would continue to be mine until I decided otherwise. The kitchen was small but perfectly functional for someone who actually knew how to cook for himself and didn't need to prepare meals for freeloading house guests who treated every dinner like a restaurant service they were entitled to receive. I could make exactly what I wanted to eat, when I wanted to eat it, without having to listen to commentary about my techniques or demands for different seasonings. Peace, it turned out, was a lot simpler than I'd remembered. It didn't require constant negotiation or careful management of other people's feelings or strategic avoidance of topics that might cause conflict. It just required the absence of people who didn't belong in your life, and the presence of space to be yourself without explanation or apology. The Neighborhood Gossip Network, according to Mrs. Henderson's occasional updates, had turned the Hayes brothers into local legends, and not the good kind. Apparently, they'd managed to wear out their welcome at 3 different relatives' houses in the span of 2 months, each stay ending in some kind of dramatic confrontation about money, responsibility, or basic human decency. Clara had moved back in with her parents, which was probably the most appropriate ending possible for someone who'd never really learned the difference between being married and being a child. Her Facebook posts, which I occasionally check the way you might slow down to look at a car accident, were full of vague references to new beginnings and learning who your real friends are, the kind of motivational nonsense that people post when they're trying to convince themselves that their life choices weren't completely disastrous. Darren had apparently found work at a construction company, though according to the Neighborhood Intelligence Network, he'd already been written up twice for showing up late and once for arguing with a supervisor about safety protocols. Some people never learn that the world doesn't owe them anything, and consequences are just the universe's way of trying to teach lessons to people who weren't paying attention the first time. Victor had simply vanished, which was probably the smartest thing he'd done in years. Sometimes the best solution to a problem you can't solve is to become someone else's problem, and Victor had apparently mastered that particular life strategy. The divorce papers, when they finally came, were almost anticlimactic. Just more legal documents to sign, more evidence that what I'd thought was a partnership had really been a one-sided support system for people who confused taking with deserving. Clara had signed everything without contest, probably because her lawyer had explained exactly how little leverage she had in a situation where she'd voluntarily chosen her unemployed brothers over her employed husband. But the real victory wasn't in the legal documents or the financial settlements or even the satisfaction of watching the Hayes brothers face the consequences of their actions. The real victory was in the realization that I didn't need any of them. Not Clara, not her dysfunctional family, not the suburban dream that had turned into a suburban nightmare. I'd built a good life once, and I could build another one. Better this time, because now I knew the difference between people who added value to your existence and people who just took up space in it. I knew the difference between compromise and capitulation, between family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior, between love and convenience. The balcony of my loft faced west, which meant I could sit out there in the evenings and watch the sunset while the city settled into its nighttime rhythm. No neighbors peering over fences, no unwanted house guests making noise downstairs, no wife scrolling through her phone instead of dealing with the reality of our relationship. Just me, a good book, and the kind of peace that money can't buy but good decisions can earn. Sometimes Clara called, usually late at night when she'd had a few drinks and was feeling nostalgic about the life she'd thrown away. I'd see her name on the caller ID and let it ring, because we'd already said everything that needed to be said. She'd made her choice, I'd made mine, and the conversation was over. The last time she called, she left a voicemail asking if we could talk about everything and maybe find a way to work things out. I listened to the message once, deleted it, and blocked her number. Not out of anger or spite, but because some bridges are meant to be burned completely, and this was definitely one of them. My revenge hadn't been loud or dramatic or even particularly creative. It had just been precise, systematic, and absolutely final. I'd used the system exactly the way it was designed to be used, and the system had delivered exactly the results it was supposed to deliver. Justice isn't always flashy, but it's always satisfying when it's served properly. These days, when people ask me about my divorce, I tell them it was the best decision I ever made. Not because I enjoy being single, but because I learned that being alone is infinitely preferable to being with people who don't respect you, value you, or deserve you. And as I sit on my balcony, breathing freely for the first time in years, I can honestly say that revenge, served cold, calculated, and completely legal, tastes exactly like freedom.